After the original Metroid proved to be a success on the NES, it was clear that a sequel would inevitably be on the way. However, while the team behind the original, Nintendo's R&D1, was still behind the next installment, they decided to take it to the Game Boy. Despite their release window aligning perfectly with that of the Super Nintendo, they were dead set on making this one a handheld release. And so, in a move that still confuses me, the dark and atmospheric Metroid was crunched down to fit on a handheld. Similarly to the first game, the original Metroid 2 is a game that I can't bring myself to play. One look at it will give you a good idea as to why. Being a Game Boy title means that it has aged extremely poorly. It's a step above the original in terms of gameplay, but that's not saying much at all. It's no surprise that after Zero Mission released and proved to be a fantastic recreation of the original game, fans were practically begging for Metroid 2 to get the same treatment. Problem is, Nintendo never obliged. Not too long after it became obvious that Nintendo had no plans for a Metroid 2 remake, several fans jumped into action to attempt to make one of their own. The vast majority of these failed, but one persevered. Milton Guasti's AM2R project, short for Another Metroid 2 Remake, began in 2008, and he regularly posted updates about it during development. This continued long after all other similar projects had already died down, and in 2016, on Metroid's 30th anniversary, AM2R was publicly released. There was a brief moment of joy across the entire fanbase, but it was quickly followed by one of the most controversial moments in not only the history of Metroid, but of Nintendo as a whole. AM2R was hit with a DMCA takedown only one day after release, effectively throwing 8 years of publicly displayed work away without warning. However, this wouldn't be nearly as big an issue if it weren't for the surrounding context. Nintendo had done absolutely nothing to celebrate Metroid's 30th anniversary on their own, essentially publicly expressing to their fans that they do not care about the series. The only thing that even came close was the release of Metroid Prime Federation Force, a co-op shooter that absolutely nobody asked for. To say that Metroid fans weren't quiet about their disappointment would be a massive understatement. AM2R was the first exciting release for the series in years, and Nintendo struck it down without hesitation. What makes this even worse is that right around this time, Sonic Mania was revealed, along with the fact that it was being developed by former fan game creators that Sega hired. So while Sega fan game creators were getting support and job opportunities from their work, Nintendo fan game creators were getting shut down with no remorse. I have some extremely strong opinions on fan-created content that could honestly take up a whole video, but for now all I'll say is this. Nintendo's actions in this case, while legally justified, are incredibly misguided, counterintuitive, and ultimately disrespectful to the legacy of their own content and the fans that love it. However, the year after the AM2R situation, Nintendo surprised everybody by revealing their own official remake of Metroid 2, titled Samus Returns. While very different in style from AM2R, it was well received, and it became clear that Nintendo had finally realized Metroid's appeal and were willing to give it more chances. A few years later, and Mercury's team, the same team behind Samus Returns, is behind the wheel of Metroid Dread. Alright, so Metroid 2 has a very long and complicated history that goes mostly beyond the initial release of the game. However, unlike with the original game in Zero Mission, there's no clear-cut version of which is the best way to play Metroid 2. After a good amount of looking into each version, I decided to play the game through AM2R. Between it and Samus Returns, it's the more faithful of the two, but also closest to the style of Zero Mission, which I've already played. There are new things here, but things such as the base map design and story are the same. I know it's somewhat odd to play a fan remake, but this one is so famous that people in the fanbase often recommend it over the original and the official remake. It's incredibly high quality, so much so that it feels like an official release. This is no standard fan project, this is special. If you're skeptical, give it a try yourself. Nintendo may have taken it down, but I can say from experience that it won't take more than a simple Google search to point you in the right direction of where to find it. On a related note, since AM2R's release, Milton Guasti has actually been employed at Moon Studios, and served as a level designer on Ori and the Will of the Wisps. I've been meaning to check out the Ori games for a while now anyway, and Guasti's involvement here only makes me more anxious to see what they have to offer. He clearly knows how to make a great game, and I'm glad his work here was able to get him into the actual industry. And with all of that finally out of the way, let's jump into Metroid 2: Return of Samus. Story to the original Metroid was pretty much non-existent. Just kill the evil things on the planet and get out. Metroid 2 not only provides a lot of context to the events of the original, but continues them in a very natural-feeling way. The reason that Samus was sent to kill the Metroids is because they were being used by the space pirates. After the events of the first game, the Galactic Federation that Samus works for sent a group to the Metroid home planet, SR-388, to exterminate the species, ensuring they would never be weaponized again. However, the group goes missing. When a rescue team is sent in, the same thing happens, After realizing how dangerous the mission truly is, the Federation sends in Samus to finish the job and the events of the game kick off. Quickly after landing on SR-388, Samus begins encountering evolved Metroids. As it turns out, the Metroids in the previous game, which were already the most terrifying part of that game, were only the larval state of the species. Progressing deeper and deeper into the planet, Samus sees more and more stages of evolution, finally coming across the Queen Metroid. After killing every last one of them, she witnesses the birth of the final Metroid. The baby mistakes Samus for her mother and stays around, helping her. Samus decides that she's done enough, and spares it. Metroid 2 ends not with a bombastic action sequence, or a boss fight, or even an escape, but with a quiet and reflective journey back to the surface of the planet.
The last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
I actually like Metroid 2's story a lot. It's very simple and lacking in much depth, but it's a great concept that suits this style of game very well. It's a natural continuation from the events of the first game, and the ending is a surprisingly powerful moment. However, the best thing about this story is the way that it's told. Storytelling in Metroid 2 is almost entirely subtextual. There's the opening cutscene, but after that, not a single line of dialogue is spoken. You don't need to be told that Metroids are evolving, it's obvious enough from your first encounter with an alpha. When you come across the baby at the very end, there's no awkward text describing why Samus turns around on her initial goal. It's self-explanatory through the way that things play out. This was totally necessary for the time, but even when replicated intentionally, it works extremely well. AM2R adds a lot of optional data logs in addition to the main story, and even some new scenarios. For one thing, you actually get to see the initial Federation group that was sent down here, even if they only show up briefly. None of this is required to understand the narrative at all, it's purely supplemental material, but it does a great job of fleshing out SR-388 and the overarching story. Talking about presentation with this game is pretty tricky because of how wildly different each version is, but since I played AM2R, I'm going to focus completely on that. For a fan remake, this looks absolutely phenomenal. Even discounting the fact that it's unofficial, this is one of the best looking sprite-based games I've ever seen. Backgrounds are vibrant and detailed, animations are sleek and fluid, particle effects look fantastic, and everything is polished to a remarkable degree. The soundtrack here is really great as well. You may remember in my review of the original how I praised the soundtrack for capturing the perfect mix of atmosphere and adventure, and Metroid 2 is similar, but it takes a different approach. Due to the nature of the game itself, the areas become darker and more sinister the further you venture into SR-388, and the soundtrack reflects this. The game starts out pretty upbeat with songs like the Surface theme. However, it doesn't take long for themes to become more somber and atmospheric. By the time you reach the last few areas, the soundtrack takes on a creepier and more unsettling tone. And once the baby Metroid is discovered and Samus quietly reflects on her journey, the track that plays during the ending perfectly reflects that. Once again, the level of quality in AM2R's presentation proves itself to be beyond impressive, especially for a fan project. In terms of actual gameplay, Metroid 2 plays out pretty similarly to the first game for the most part, but with a few key differences. Firstly, as I mentioned before, the main goal here is to kill all Metroids on the planet. You'll still be finding new abilities and using them to access different areas across the map, just like before, but while the areas are connected, you bounce between them much less than before. Once you clear an area, most of the time you move on for good. Plopping you on one huge map with dozens of Metroids scattered all over the place could have been very messy, so the game designers smartly made it so you have to take down all of them in a designated area before proceeding to the next. All of these feel like very condensed realizations of the Metroid formula established in the last game, usually centered around just one ability. In that sense, they almost remind me of Zelda dungeons. You explore it for a bit, take note of what you can and can't access, find an ability that lets you bypass previous obstacles, and move on to the next area. I honestly really like the structure here. I feel like it gives the game a good sense of momentum, and it's really effective seeing how the areas later on in the game become a lot darker than the ones closer to the surface. However, this structure is the most controversial aspect of Metroid 2, as it causes the game as a whole to be significantly more linear than the first game. Where that one had you traveling between areas frequently, Metroid 2 is very much a straight-shot journey to the Queen's Lair, with a few required detours. On one hand, I can absolutely understand why this may put off some fans of the original, but I found that each of the individual areas were so well designed that it's hard for me to care. I think one of the big drawbacks here for a lot of people is that in stark contrast to the last game, there's very little opportunity for sequence breaking. Future areas are completely gated off until you've killed all of the Metroids in the current area, so getting a lot of upgrades early is out of the question. That's not to say there's no opportunity here, especially in AM2R, but it's definitely not as relevant of an idea as it was before. This does not bother me at all, since similarly to last time, I'm too inexperienced to care much, but it is something that I feel is worth noting for people who are really into that kind of thing. You can definitely feel that Metroid 2 was designed around a handheld. It maintains a consistency in both progression and pacing throughout the journey, but it's well divided into numerous smaller chunks. I don't think this is a bad thing at all, just a distinction. I also think that the way they went about making this distinction is very clever. It's well written into the story and still maintains the core of what makes Metroid unique. I really like all of the Metroid fights here. There are obviously quite a few of them as they're the main objective throughout the game, but thankfully they never get too repetitive. A lot of the time the challenge comes from the different kinds of environments you're thrown into. Some will be in very basic arenas where the only thing to focus on is the enemy, while others will force you to think about positioning a lot more. It also helps that Metroids learn as you fight more and more of them, beginning to dodge or swipe away your missiles. Whenever a certain type of Metroid fight begins to get stale, you'll probably run into the next evolution very quickly. I could have done without fighting the Omega Metroid 4 times in a row, but aside from that, these are very fun fights that I never got tired of. And while I'm not sure if it technically counts, the final boss, the Queen Metroid, is a fantastic encounter. It starts off pretty basic, but before long she'll be backing you down. After chasing you through numerous walls, she'll back you into a corner and eat you, which is where you finally take her down in one of the coolest ways imaginable. I love how gruesome this death is too. It looks amazing, but more importantly serves as a great impetus for Samus' decision to save the baby Metroid in just a few minutes. Overall, a really well done final encounter. Aside from the main structure of the game and the Metroid encounters, Metroid 2 plays pretty much exactly how you'd expect a Metroid sequel to play. Samus starts off a bit more powerful than she did in the first game, but she's still very weak, so you have to explore to find all of her abilities again. The feeling of getting more powerful as your moveset grows more versatile is just as satisfying as before, and once again it's ultimately what makes the game so good. While I can't speak for any other version of the game, AM2R feels fantastic to control. It feels like a very natural evolution of Zero Mission's control scheme, and playing both titles back to back just furthered that connection. There are a few new things here, such as the Morph Ball having a dedicated button, but it's mostly the same as what came before. It worked great there, and it works just as well here. For AM2R specifically, there are a lot of new segments here that aren't present in either of the official versions of the game. There's no huge endgame edition like Jozodia and Zero Mission, but there are a lot of great new boss fights and areas. I really like all of these additions. They're sprinkled throughout really naturally, and I even had to check online to tell what was new and what was in the original already while I was writing the script for this video. The easiest comparison to make in the grand scheme of things is that AM2R does for Metroid 2 what Zero Mission did for the original. That was clearly the goal during development, and Milton Guasti did a fantastic job. Controls are tightened up, presentation is overhauled, new content is added while not disrupting the pace of the game, and everything is polished to an incredible level. It's very easy to simply pick up and get into, and I found myself enjoying it so much that I nearly finished the game in my first sitting, only stopping because I didn't have any more time to play. It's a modern release and it feels like one, and while I've said it multiple times already, it genuinely astonishes me that this is all just a fan project because the quality is so high. AM2R is one of the best remakes ever made and is a remarkable effort that will be fondly remembered for years to come. Despite some potentially controversial changes to the formula, Metroid 2 proved itself to be a great sequel. Everything here is just as good if not better, and because the game constantly pushes the pace forward, there wasn't a second of playtime here where I wasn't enjoying myself. The story, while nothing remarkable, is pretty good, and from what I understand serves as a critical turning point for what's to come in future installments. Metroid was a good game, but Metroid 2 is a great one. Metroid 2 is just one of those games where I can't bring myself to think of any weak elements. It may not be as easily accessible to beginners as Zero Mission, and ironically enough it might put off fans of the original's potential for sequence breaking, but it's just a great time from beginning to end. It hasn't even been a week since I finished the game at the time of writing, but the temptation to return to it is already abundant. I actively want to go back through and comb through every last corner of the map to pick up everything I missed. I want to go back and fight the bosses again, hunt down all the Metroids again, experience the chilling final walk with the baby Metroid again. I just want more Metroid 2. As a game, Metroid 2 is great, but as a sequel it improves on its predecessor in a very natural way. It sets itself apart with a distinct identity that does not reject what came before, but instead approaches it from a different angle. I enjoyed the first installment, but looking back, I connected with this one so much more. This is the game that got me hooked on Metroid. This is the game that consumed my thoughts, ejecting me with incitement every time it so much as brought up. This is the game that made me a Metroid fan.